Going in 5, 4, 3, 2, they're live.
Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Building Power. And I'm your host, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. Really excited today to bring on my brother and friend, Dr. Chike Akua. You guys are going to learn a lot today. He has a lot of experience, a lot of expertise in the area of education, urban education, and African-centered education. And so we're really, again, excited to have him here today to provide some tools and resources for families as we, as you know, deal with this ever-evolving institution of education, particularly K through 12, where, you know, folks, families, and communities are trying to really figure out, you know, what we're going to do with this upcoming school year. So I'm going to take some time now to read the bio for Dr. Akua, and then we're going to go into a short video that will give you a little bit more of a visual of the kind of work that he's been doing for a very long time now. Dr. Akua is a professor of educational leadership at the Clark Atlanta University and a leading authority on increasing the achievement of today's students, especially those in some of the most challenging schools and communities. His book, Education for Transformation, is a favorite among teachers and leaders and has been endorsed by a number of prominent national education educators. As a recognized master teacher, Dr. Akua has been an invited keynote presenter and trainer at regional and national conferences, school systems, colleges, and universities. With a culturally relevant approach, he is known for his dynamic, interactive presentations to leaders, teachers, parents, and students. Dr. Akua has over 25 years of combined experience in education, first as a public school teacher, a curriculum developer, professional development provider, leadership consultant, policy analyst, and now, of course, as a university professor. In 1995, he was selected as Teacher of the Year for the Newport News Public Schools District in Virginia, and was also selected as one of Ebony Magazine's 50 Leaders of Tomorrow. A year later, in 1996, the DeKalb County Board of Education, Atlanta, Georgia, recognized him with an Excellence in Education Award of Service to Youth. Additionally, you know, he's done amazing work in the area of education leadership. So now we want to turn to a short video that will actually give you, again, more of a visual of the kind of work that he's been doing over the last 25 years.
Transformation Institute, where we use standards-based, research-driven, culturally relevant instructional strategies to increase student achievement. Now, those are just some big sounding words to say that our children are brilliant, Ashe?
So tell us why you wanted to be a part of the Educational Transformation Institute day to day.
So first of all, it's Dr. Chike Akua. If you know anything about him, he's such a passionate educator. He's just an expert in the field. And really what we need to do is learn from experts in the field about how we can better reach and teach our African American students and our students of color. So it's truly a blessing to be a part of this experience.
I think it's important that our leaders of today learn more about this. It's one thing to sit here and say we need to address an issue. It's another thing to get the information and now be able to take this information and apply it. So I think it's huge that he's here sharing all his knowledge with us. Now it's up to us as leaders to go back and now implement some of his teachings to our kids, to our teachers, to everyone that we come in contact with.
I see.
So tell us why you felt the urge to be a part of the teacher transformation today.
I am always looking for ways to support all of our students in the classroom. And I felt that this training and this time together would equip me to be a better teacher. A SIBA, a master teacher. So I'm very excited to be here today and appreciate everything we're learning.
So this training really provides an opportunity for us to reach those students that aren't getting the attention they need.
I've already have some things that I want to take back, some things I want to share with my students, things I didn't know before, things that were eye-opening, that were the light bulb. And so if it enlightened me, I want to take that back to enlighten my students.
I have 4 pages of a notepad full already, so yes, I've gotten a lot out of it.
I too have a lot of notes and a lot of things that I want to implement tomorrow. You know, that's this presentation really has brought to light a lot of things that I thought I knew that I really don't know as well as I should, and just I'm really interested about looking up some of the resources and the philosophies that he's teaching me now.
Hi, my name is Dr. Chike Akua. I'm a teacher transformation specialist. And if you're wondering why all these teachers are smiling, it's because they just had the teacher transformation experience. Listen, after traveling all over the country and working with thousands of educators in all different parts of the country, what we've discovered is that teachers and leaders want to do better. They want to increase student achievement, but many of them have not been given the proper professional development to make it happen. So when they do receive the proper training, they're overwhelmed with joy and can't wait to get back to the classroom. Listen, if this sounds like what your teachers and leaders need, get in contact with us at the Teacher Transformation Institute. At the Teacher Transformation Institute, we use standards-based, research-driven, culturally relevant and responsive techniques to increase student achievement. Check us out online at myteachertransformation.com. That's myteachertransformation.com.
All right, so that was an amazing short video, and hopefully folks know a little bit more from those testimonials about the amazing work that you've been doing, Dr. Akua. Again, we're excited to have you as a guest. I want to start off, just asking you to just tell us a little bit more about your concept of education for transformation. What does that mean?
Sure. Education for transformation is the process of recapturing and practicing the ancient African and the African American tradition of educational excellence. Problem with that is most people are not aware that that tradition of educational excellence exists, not only amongst African Americans, but going back thousands and thousands of years into ancient African history. In fact, African people have the longest tradition of educational excellence and shared it with the world. And so whenever and wherever we see ourselves having problems and challenges in education today, it's very, very important that our educators and leaders are not only aware of that history and legacy, but can go back and tap into it in order to recreate it today.
That's amazing. And that's, to me, I feel like that's exactly, what we need in this moment. To piggyback on that a little bit, have you thought about, in terms of how, how does that look different, if it does at all, in this moment of education evolving? As you know, a lot of education now within the district level and really all other places, charter, no matter what the education system looks like, is going to be online. Is there any particular tools or strategies that you think would be helpful for parents and then even educators in this current moment of online learning?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much that is online that you can find, but you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to have the consciousness to actually look for it. So as I mentioned, a lot of teachers, leaders, and parents are not aware that this body of knowledge even exists. We've developed some resources online that teachers, leaders, and parents can use. If you go to tticlassroom.com, again, TTI as in Teacher Transformation Institute, tticlassroom.com, where we have video modules structured for that very, very purpose, to teach and train the teachers, also to give parents insight, and then also specific lessons for the students. From my book, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations. And this is so important because, a lot of teachers and leaders are not aware of what's possible for our children. And so what happens is they get taught a dumbed down curriculum. The students are not engaged. And once not engaged, they begin to mentally check out or opt out. And some studies have shown that that children who physically drop out in high school actually mentally opted out way back in late elementary school or middle school. And so this raises the question of culturally relevant and responsive teaching, because if I come to your classroom and what you're teaching me is not relevant to life as I will face it, then what am I here for? I'm going to start acting out, or I'm just going to completely check out. I'm going to put my head down on the table. I'm not going to care. And we see this happening all the time, not because African-American children are not inquisitive, not because they're not intelligent, not because they're not capable, but because the schooling process that they've been taken through is not relevant to the circumstances of their life as they will face it. And so going back to when I was a middle school teacher, one of the things that helped me to connect with my students and literally take some students from F's to A's was when I injected and infused our culture into the curriculum when and where it wasn't there, which was most of the time. So, I'm looking at the textbook they gave me to teach from, and, we're not in it. Or if we are in it, it's in a very superficial way. It's like, you pepper a few people of color into a Eurocentric curriculum and then you call it multicultural. Well, no, that's not even authentic multicultural education. So these are the things that increase student engagement and student achievement when our students see themselves in the curriculum, when they see themselves in the textbooks, when they see themselves in the examples, and get this, when we use the methods that are unique to reaching African-American students and students of color. There are specific teaching techniques and strategies that have been proven to help to increase engagement and achievement for African-American students.
And this is a good time too to remind our audience, if you listening today, if you have questions or comments, please make sure that you drop them into the chat function on YouTube, but also you can drop them into the function on Facebook for all of our Facebook listeners. This is going to be very interactive. As you all know, towards the end of the conversation, we try to make sure that we get those questions in, because I can imagine just from what you just said a few minutes ago around tools and strategies to effectively reach Black students and other children of color. I can imagine if there's educators watching this and even parents, they want to know, wow, what is that? Because we hear so much negative, statistics and negative kind of narratives about our children. That's probably going to be a place where people want to know a little bit more. But I want to ask you really quickly to talk to us about the cultural mismatch in education today and what can be done about it.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any secret that the vast majority of teachers that our children encounter are white and female. And that represents a serious demographic and cultural mismatch. And I'll give you some stats from some work that I did with Dr. Leslie Fenwick, the Dean Emeritus at Howard University. So slightly more than 90% of urban school teachers are white. So just let that settle in for just a minute. And then—
Wait, 90%? Because I've always heard 80.
So in urban areas, it's
in urban.
When you drill down into the inner city, okay, it's 73% of the teachers are white.
Wow.
So, and then nearly 70% of the inner city school principals are white. Okay, so I want you to just think about that for just a moment. Now, when you go into our schools and you see this demographic mismatch, people could look at that and say, man, where are the Black teachers? Where are the Black leaders? And one could emerge from watching that and looking at that and say, man, these people must not even care about the education of their own children. Not so. This demographic mismatch was actually forced, okay? Coming out of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was supposed to desegregate schools, actually in the process, over 39,000 Black teachers and leaders were either demoted, displaced, or out and out fired. One more time, demoted. So you're a principal And now with so-called integration coming, we're going to make you an assistant principal, and we're literally going to put your office in a broom closet. This is some of the things that actually happen. And we're going to put somebody over you who doesn't have a fraction of the credentials, expertise, or experience that you do. A lot of people are not aware that the most credentialed educators in the United States of America are Black males. Again, this is coming out of the research of Dr. Leslie Fenwick. The most credentialed, meaning master's degree, PhD, if that's the metric that you're using. Now, we know that doesn't always translate into competency. I just want to be clear about that. But if you tell me, okay, you got to get your master's degree, you got to get your PhD, you got to get your leadership certification, and I go and do that, and yet I'm still demoted, displaced, or out now fired, that's a problem. So if that happened between 1954 and 1974, that you lost 39,000 Black teachers and leaders who were known to connect with our students, who established a standard of excellence and held our children to it, even with less resources. What is the cumulative effect of losing 39,000 Black teachers and leaders? And now Dr. Fenwick's research is showing that it's really more like over 100,000. But when you take that up to now in 2020, where there was this forced displacement of Black educators, we're in a serious, serious crisis. So I just want to be clear about that. So not only do you have that crisis in terms of a lack of Black male and female teachers, then you have the influx of white female teachers who have not been taught and trained in African-centered, culturally relevant, or culturally responsive teaching methods. This is a recipe for absolute disaster. All of this was prior to COVID-19. So you can imagine now that we're in the midst of COVID-19, it's the cascading domino effect of this is having tragic effects on our children. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is because I was one of the people who in a sense was caught up in it. You know, when I was in high school, I had a 1.9 GPA. Elementary school, I was a good student, A's and B's, okay? Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, I'm sure you're familiar with, had a theory that he called the fourth grade failure syndrome, that Black children, Black boys in particular, enter school highly energetic, highly inquisitive, and want to learn. But the process of schooling, not education, but the process of schooling makes them very disenchanted with the process, okay? And so the fourth grade failure syndrome for me didn't happen in fourth grade, it happened in sixth grade. And so from sixth grade to 12th grade, that's when sixth grade, I got my first D, I got 3 D. Then eighth grade, I got my first F, and it just kept going downhill. It took me till my senior year in high school to recover, and I barely recovered in time to barely get in college, okay? Now here's the thing, I come from what many people would say, oh, you come from a good family, both parents in the home, both parents professionals, and this is why I went into education. I said, man, if I almost fell through the cracks, what about brothers and sisters out here who didn't have the advantages that I had, who didn't have the opportunities that I had? And certainly we see that going on right now.
Yeah, that's something that also that I'm very passionate about. Your story intersects with mine, and you brought up Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu. His work actually helped politicize me. As you know, I got into education activism and advocacy work when my then 3-year-old son, my little Black baby boy, was identified as a problem, and the school wanted to expel him, the preschool. And that's when I was introduced to this idea that there's actually a preschool to prison pipeline that disproportionately impacts Black students.
Mm-hmm.
In preschool, Black boys the numbers for Black boys are even more exacerbated. So this thing is very systemic, and you're right, all of his teachers were white women. And at that time, like I said, I wasn't very politicized and certainly didn't have the knowledge that I have now. But I read Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu's book, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And when I tell you that book in 2011 applied to my experience, I think he wrote that book, the first edition in 1982.
In the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, and
I encountered it in the 90s.
Exactly. And here I am encountering it in the second half of the 2000s. This was 2011, you know? So, so I think, you know, this is a really critical conversation to have, and something that I have been thinking about. And as you know, you and I talked a little bit about this before we went live, is that I'm thinking in this COVID-19 moment, in this moment where education is truly, literally transforming in front of us, how it's been done, I don't want to go back to the same schools. We can't.
Right. Yeah, we definitely need to seize this moment. This is a moment like no other. Notwithstanding the great suffering that many have struggled and suffered with dealing with COVID-19 and everything that has happened as a result of that. However, this represents a time like no other that we must take control of our children's education. We have tools at our disposal that we've never had before in terms of the technology and the ability to reach larger numbers of people. You have independent African-centered schools who are now teaching people nationally and internationally, and had been doing that prior to COVID-19. But you need to know that those are out there as well. There are schools like Aya Educational Institute, Uncle Ben Institute. These are just a couple of the ones in Atlanta. You have Freedom Home Academy in Chicago with Brother Marcus Klein, and there are a number of others. Quilombo Educational Institute here in Atlanta as well.
Atlanta just got all the schools. It's time for me to come down there with my kids.
We have a lot, but the great thing is, again, due to technology, we now have the ability to communicate across the airwaves. But that I want to be very clear that there still needs to be an adult in the home guiding and directing it. You can't just turn your children over to other people and expect them to do everything for you. But what's really important about these schools, and I'll tell you, a big turning point from me when I got into education was meeting and having the opportunity to kind of go through an initiation process with Dr. Asa Hilliard. He started something in 2001 called the Jegna Collective. Jegna is an Amharic Ethiopian term which refers to the master teacher, and there are 7 criteria for that. But one thing he did with us was he changed our whole orientation about what's possible for our children. And to give you an example of that, he showed us videos of Black children reciting poetry at 3 years old. He showed us videos of Black children in the 3rd grade doing calculus, okay? So when I was going through this, now I was already a quote unquote teacher of the year, thought I knew a little bit something about our history and culture. But what he shared with us at that time was so powerful because it shattered the European theories that I had been taught. Coming through the schools of education, we're taught the human growth and development theories of Piaget and Maslow and others. And they say at this age, a child should be able to do this. And at this age, a child should be able to think abstractly. And at this age, a child should be able to do this. Well, this is white folks looking at their children and telling you what their children can do and then applying it to all children.
That's right.
Problems of how this is one of the problems of how Eurocentricity masquerades itself as universal. So when you look at your child and say that all children should be able to do this at that age, well, that's your child. But when Black people look at Black children, that's a whole different thing. Amos Wilson tells us in The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, when they run tests on Black children, straight out of the womb, all of the quote unquote intelligence tests that Europeans develop, Black children score off the scale. So how is it that later on down the line, we have these so-called achievement gaps, which the achievement gap notion is a farce because, for one thing, if white children, achievement gap is supposedly the gap in achievement between Black children and white children. But if white children are achieving at mediocre levels to begin with, we're not trying to get to mediocre. We need to compare the gap between where our children are now and Black excellence. So take them out of the picture, right? So people keep throwing around this term, the achievement gap, rather than looking at the access and opportunity gaps, the access to a quality education, the access to a highly qualified teacher, the access to a teacher who has been trained in culturally relevant and responsive teaching techniques and or African-centered teaching techniques, the opportunity to have the proper funding. There are access and opportunity gaps which produce the achievement gap. But when you hear achievement gap, you immediately think of the child. When we hear access and opportunity gaps, oh, now we're spotlighting on the system that is producing these results with the children intentionally. Intentionally. I want to be very, very clear about that, because as Dr. John Henrik Clarke says, the powerful will never educate the powerless to take their power from them. I need to say that again. The powerful will never educate the powerless to take their power from them. And that is why this is our time to take our children back. Very, very important.
Extremely important. And so I'll do a quick plug that we'll actually be having a larger conversation about this and hopefully, you know, figuring out what kind of things that we can actually be doing to do just that, Dr. Akua, to take our children back, to use this moment to really demand what we know our children need. I'm so grateful that you invoked the name of the great ancestor Amos Wilson, who I consider my Jegna. When I became politicized, I immersed myself in his work.
Oh, yes.
And I remember reading those studies that Black children as babies outperformed all other children. And one of the things that I thought was interesting and that really triggered me said that Black children did not start to regress until they actually entered school.
That's deep.
And I was like, they're right. Yeah. I said, so this sounds systemic to me. You know what I mean? There's an intentional undereducation, miseducation of the masses of Black children. That's not a conspiracy theory. There's evidence of that, right? Like the so-called achievement gap has been documented for decades, and people have been spending millions of dollars to so-called correct it. But here we are in 2020 with sometimes in some cities, even worse numbers for Black children. Yeah. And so we have to, we'll talk about this a little more. I want to talk a little bit more, and I know you're an expert in this piece, and this is something that is critically important to me as a mother, because I've seen how it actually transformed my own children's life, is what is your take on African-centered education? What does that mean, and why is it important?
Yeah, so first of all, I think we have to understand what it is before we can say what our take on it is, because there are a lot of misconceptions about it. You know, as soon as you raise that as a question, a lot of Black parents will say, well, you know, no, I don't want my child to have an African-centered education because they need to be able to interact with all people. Well, wait a minute, you're making quite an assumption there that they can't interact with all people. Or they may say something like, well, there's more information out there that my child needs to know than just about African people, or my children aren't in Africa, my children are in America. So all these misconceptions, okay? So let's break down what it is first. And what I did was I looked at the research literature and into a shorter definition that I think people can understand and grasp onto. African-centered education is centering ourselves in the best of African culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems for Black people. Now, I'm gonna go to each part of that definition. Centering ourselves in the best of African culture. Now, most of our children have not been centered in the best of our culture. They've been centered in the worst of our culture. And they begin to associate their Blackness with ignorance, being uneducated, being violent, and being criminal. They associate Blackness with that not because they haven't been centered, they've been decentered from the best of their culture, okay? So African-centered education is centering our ourselves first and then our children in the best of African culture, to examine and analyze information, meaning putting that lens on what we see. What we see is unique from what other people see. You know, the different videos that have been circulating of executions of Black people in America and so forth, we see the police brutality. It's very clear to us. We see through a different lens. We see microaggressions, we see macroaggressions, whereas other people can't see it. This is why it's so important to view things and analyze information from our perspective. Because what happens when you don't is you're looking through European eyes, and the conclusions that you draw may not serve you well, and historically have not served us well. So let me go back to the top. Centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture, to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. When we go to school, we don't learn how to solve problems and meet needs in our communities. We learn how to solve problems for white people. And we hope we can get enough, degrees and all those sorts of things that they'll hire us to make money for them. And we feel good because they hired us, and now I've got this job and I'm making this money. We have not learned how to meet needs and solve problems in our communities. And this is why I have to make it even a little more clear. Black history is not African-centered education. So people think when they say African-centered education, say, oh yeah, we did a Black history project on Black entertainers. Well, that's not African-centered education. It could be, but it's typically not. Or we did a Black history project on Black writers. That's fine, but that's not African-centered education. You can't, pull something, out of your hat during the shortest month of the year in February and then say that that's African-centered education. So we have to make sure that we're centered in our views and our values and in the best of our culture, so that we can use that as a lens to analyze and examine information, meet needs, and solve problems in our communities. So with that in mind, I hope that kind of gives a better idea, because coming out of an African-centered education, we should be able to provide our own jobs in our own communities. Coming out of an African-centered education, we should be able to police our own communities. Coming out of an African-centered education, we should be able to build wealth together, rather than almost 98% of our wealth leaving our community as soon as we get paid. Why? Because we've been miseducated. We've been taken through a schooling process, and as Mwalimu Mushuja teaches us, there's too much schooling and too little education. Schooling reproduces current power relations. Education brings out the very best within us and allows us to meet needs and solve problems in our communities.
Well, I think that's a whole sermon right there. I feel like we can just go on and close up shop right now. But we actually have a question from the audience. I felt like this was a good one when we were talking about in terms of how Black babies outperform. Here's a question. It says, what do you suggest parents do in their homes to prevent the halt in development outside of taking children outside of the Eurocentric schools? So it sounds like they're almost asking, is there some supplemental, is there some inoculation, right, that parents can do? How do I inoculate my child even before they go into this environment?
So the questions you ask determine the answers that you get. You're trying to inoculate your child before you send them into a system that was designed to destroy them. Why put them in an environment that is designed to nurture them? And that's a tough thing to grasp. I get it. Me and my wife have gone through this with our two sons. Youngest son's about to graduate from high school this year. And it was rough, even though both of us are educators. But let me tell parents what they can do from the beginning. Knowing what I know about education, when our first son was born, I knew that the current systems of schooling attempt to take the identity of our children. I call it cultural identity theft, okay? So when my son was about 4 years old and we sent him to his first preschool, which was Black owned, I wouldn't say that they were using an African-centered curriculum, but we felt we could supplement it, right? So we're walking up to the door and I asked him, I said, what's your name? He says, my name is Jabari. I said, Jabari who? Chike Akua. I said, what does that mean? Brave and mighty messenger of the Most High. What does a messenger do? Brings a message from the Lord. So now the reason he knew that is because this was the common lesson. Every day at bath time, we're singing a song about that, all that kind of stuff, telling him what his name is and what it means as it relates to his mission and purpose for being on the planet. The next day we drive up to the school, we park, we're walking up. I said, what's your name? He said, my name is Jabari. Jabari what? Chike Akua. What does that mean? Brave and mighty messenger of the Most High. What does a messenger do? Brings a message from the Lord. I give him a hug, I send him off to school. By the third or fourth day that I did this with him, finally he's like, Dad, why do you keep asking me what my name means? I say, because I'm sending you into a school where other students may not know that. And I'm sending you out into a world where that attempts to take our identity from us. This is why I say education is identity restoration. Again, education is identity restoration. Naeem Akbar tells us in his book, Know Thyself, the first function of education is to establish identity. The first function of education is to establish identity. And then identity determines activity. So if I think I'm a thug, if I take on that identity, then that becomes my activity. If I think I'm a criminal, if I take on the identity of a criminal, then that becomes my activity. This is why I said education is identity restoration, because we see our children taking on these alien identities all the time because they've associated Blackness with being pimps, players, criminals, and thugs. Not only do they take on that identity, that obscures who the real pimps are.
Come on, Dr. Akua.
Players and the pimps, players, criminals, and thugs really are.
Right.
True education will teach you who you are and who the real gangsters are.
That just really inspired me. And what you were describing was affirmations. I did that with my children. I do that with my son and my daughter. And we would do those affirmations before they would go to school, so that you're right. I mean, you're sending your child into a system that wasn't designed. In fact, it was, like you said, designed to destroy them. But I think we have to reconcile that is this society in general, not just schools. Every institution is anti-Black. And so because we still have, like you said, we have not been educated to control the resources and things like that in our community. Right now, we're still in this position where we do have to, just like our ancestors did on plantations, we have to make a way out of no way, or make a way to deal with, to deal with what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I was just going to say to the parent that asked that question, it is a constant conversation. My sons are 17 and 20. They don't agree with a lot of the things that I say. But the great thing about that is when we sit down to talk, they have to give me a compelling argument as to why they want to do something or why they think a certain way. And guess what? So do I. A lot of things that I present in public, I don't present it until I've shared it with my wife and my sons, because if I can get past them, because they will rip it to shreds. If I can get past them and get them to agree with me, I know I can take any audience, right? And so they don't just readily accept things. So it's a constant conversation. When my son got accepted to a special STEM middle school, right, which is supposed to be prestigious and everything, I had to sit him down. I said, okay, you need to understand that while there's a significant population of Black students in this school and in this program, you need to understand the difference between Eurocentric science and African science. Oh, Dad, here you go. Science is science. Come on, it's not that deep. No, science is not just science, it is that deep. Eurocentric science uses scientific innovation to control and manipulate people. African sacred science is about meeting needs and solving human problems. And I'm able to demonstrate that. I have a whole presentation where I show the difference. But if you don't know that, then you look at the weapons of mass distraction, the weapons of mass deception, and the weapons of mass destruction that are being created, and you just say, oh, that's natural. No, that's not natural. That's not our way. That's not our science. What did science look like when we shared it with the world? When you go back into the Amos Mathematics papyrus of ancient Kemet, going back over 3,800 years ago, and known to be a copy of an older African text where they break down the scientific method. Yeah, that probably wasn't in your science book growing up, but you know, these that we need to be aware of that have been intentionally hidden from us. It's very important that we realize that this was all very intentional. Yet another reason why we need to regain control of the education of our children and the resources that have been allocated to so-called educate our children. Because education is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry.
That's the fight. You know that's going to be the fight, right? I mean, we're going to have to go up against folks that look like us when we get ready to talk about having access to those billions of dollars to actually educate our children in the ways in which they need to be educated. You know, and we talked about this a little bit, and we don't have to get off too far if you don't want to, but I want people to know that Black people, Black parents have always resisted. We've never just laid down and accepted the harsh treatment that our children get currently in the system. And I want to point our listeners to the Black parents and Puerto Rican parents in the Brownsville neighborhood in New York City, who actually fought and won temporarily community control over their schools, installed their own teachers, kicked out the teachers who at that time were mostly white, who were not teaching their children, who were in fact very antagonistic towards the community and parents and had a very negative view towards the community and parents, and installed their own teachers and principals and even their own school board. We can share a link later in the comments for people to learn a little bit more about that. It's been 50 years now, and it was actually celebrated on NPR in February of this year. There was a podcast actually done about it, and I'm happy to share that later. But just wanting people to know that there are ways that I think that we need to be looking back for some of the lessons from the past and learn, right? You know, some of the shortcomings of other than the powerful teachers unions who pushed back and won against those parents. But this is something that I believe that is worth fighting for the very reasons that you listed, Dr. Akua. It's about transforming our communities, but more than that, it's about transforming how we view ourselves and how we think about ourselves.
Well, you raise a very interesting point. Anytime you run into a serious challenge or a serious issue of power relations, because that's what this is about, you need to find out where the money is, okay? And here's the challenge. People get paid when our children fail. People get paid more when our children fail than they do when our children succeed. And so when there is an economic motive to fail our children, you better believe there will be systems and structures in place that are seemingly intractable. It seems like you can't get beyond them. They're going to put systems and structures in place to ensure that we continue to fail. To give you a quick example, a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, had a contract to work with a school in the Midwest that was the lowest performing middle school in the district. He went there about 10 times over the course of a month and was working with the teachers and the leadership to bring them up to speed on their skills and so forth. And over the course of several months, this school started to outperform other schools, right? So much so that by the end of the year, the school literally went from worst to first, okay? When they looked at the testing data, and I'm not saying testing is an authentic measure, but that's what they use. When they looked at the testing data, this school had gone from worst to first. And so what this particular school system did was they took the scores from that formerly low performing school that was now first. They took those scores and attributed them to another school. Yeah, I'm looking at your face right now because when he was telling me this, I was like, That's like lying. That's like cheating. We all heard about the Atlanta cheating scandal, right? But you didn't hear about this cheating scandal because this wasn't Black teachers. And this was a Black school going from worst to first. People get paid big money when we fail. Now, I got some homework for our viewers because I want you to look up another article. This was an article in the Washington Post that Dr. Leslie Fenwick wrote. And it said, in substance, that school reform is really about land redevelopment.
Uh-oh.
One more time, school reform is really about land redevelopment. Just Google that. Washington Post, Leslie Fenwick. The name is spelled F-E-N-W-I-C-K. F as in freedom, E-N-W-I-C-K. School reform is really about land redevelopment. And it talks about how a number of these public school buildings are on prime real estate and become a part of the entire gentrification process in many of our communities. So, you know, there's a lot that we're dealing with, and I don't want to go too far into the problem without dealing with some solutions, but we need to be aware of these things and know what we're up against. And once we do, then we'll have more of these kinds of conversations to make sure that our children are of a certain consciousness and competence when they go into the world.
No, I think that's good. And I'm so glad you actually brought up that piece around the land. I remember that article. It's been several years, but I think she used DC as her case study in that article. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that's an ongoing issue. Okay, great. This has been great so far. I have one more question, and I feel like kind of ties into this. What kind of materials have you developed yourself to actually assist students and parents and teachers? What are those materials and how can our audience access them?
Sure. So if you go to myteachertransformation.com, myteachertransformation.com, and click on Books by Akua, you'll see a range of different reading material for children and parents and teachers. We have a book entitled Reading Revolution. It's a collection of 90 reading selections about African and African American heroes and sheroes. Brief reading selections, and then a brief set of multiple choice questions. We recommend that parents do one a day with their child. It's like a daily cultural multivitamin to boost the immune system, the cultural immune system.
What's the name of that book again? Because I need to get it.
Yeah, Reading Revolution. I'm beside myself. I'm so excited right now because my wife and my sons and I, it's a family project. We are now in the process of digitizing it, and where we've done the voiceovers, and it will be interactive online software that parents can get a hold of and use with their children. So if you can imagine my voice or my wife's voice, we're reading the selection as the child is reading it on the screen, and you're seeing the images of whoever it's talking about, and then you have your multiple choice questions. They're working on that right now, and it's looking quite.
What's the website again? I want to put it in the chat.
myteachertransformation.com, myteachertransformation.com, and then just click on Books by Akua. We also have a book called A Treasure Within. A Treasure Within is another one of our bestsellers, and it is a book of 3 short stories in which young people have encounters with ancient African ancestors to learn about our original morals and values and culture and history. The interesting thing about these stories is the young people in the stories are going through the same thing that all children are going through, but they're surrounded by culturally conscious adults who help them to navigate through their challenges, and they have an encounter with an ancient African ancestor to learn about our traditional values. And so children love that because it's in story form and some realistic occurrences that those children experience in the stories, okay? We also have a book called Words of Power. Words of Power is a collection of over 200 quotes and proverbs, and it has images to go with it. A lot of our children today are not growing up on that mother wit and wisdom that you or I may have grown up with. And so they're culturally disconnected. So what this does is it recenters them in the best of our traditional wisdom, because African proverbs contain the wisdom of the culture. So we have Words of Power Volume 1, and Words of Power Volume 2 should be out next month. My son wrote a book about his first trip to the motherland. It's called Sankofa Kemet, My First Trip to the Motherland, when I took him to Egypt. We have a book on Kwanzaa. We have a book called Parent Power for parents that tells you the different things that we did, my wife and I did with our sons to see that they would be inoculated against a number of the things that they would encounter out here. But even with parents like myself and my wife, there's still challenges to be contended with. There's no absolute assurance, and this is why we can't take it for granted, and we have to make sure that we're sharing critical information and having these conversations with our children every day. If you have a child around seventh or eighth grade or above, I would highly recommend this book, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations, 7 Steps to Black Student Success. This is great for parents to read too, because it contains information that we should be teaching our children. It gives them the background of, in terms of life skills, career development, dealing with situations with law enforcement and authority, dealing with relationships, how to analyze things that they see in the media. So there's all sorts of really powerful information in that book as well. So those are just a few of the examples of what you'll encounter there. For teachers, you'll also see the book Education for Transformation on that site. And then for parents, the Parent Power book is there as well.
That's amazing. That's what this show is all about, is actually giving practical tools that parents can access. In fact, that book that you recommended for students 7th grade and above, I'll actually be purchasing that for Amir. So I'll be doing that as soon as we wrap this show today. But I wanted to ask too, because I feel like this is kind of on the same length, and we have about 10 more minutes on the same thing that we've been talking about earlier, is like, what are some recommendations you would have to make for reparations in education? I think that's critical at this moment in terms of how we're thinking about evolving during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. So it was put on my spirit to really begin to look at that in a systematic way. And I'm working on developing that. I actually just spoke at the National Reparations Summit this past weekend on that actual topic. So I'm going to give you some pre-K through 12 recommendations, and then I'll give you some higher education recommendations. First of all, there needs to be annual appropriations. Anytime you hear me use the word appropriations, I'm talking about money, okay? Annual appropriations to train a new generation of Black teachers, leaders, and counselors. But not just any Black teachers and leaders and counselors. They must be trained in African-centered teaching methods, materials, content, and for the counselors, therapeutic modalities. Other people's theories don't work for us. There may be a couple of useful tools here and there that you can find. But what happens oftentimes is not enough to have a Black teacher. Because if you have a Black teacher that's been miseducated, they pass on the virus of miseducation to those that they teach. If you have a Black leader that's been miseducated, they pass on the virus of miseducation to those that they lead. If you have a Black counselor who has not been trained in African-centered therapeutic modalities, they're going to pass on the madness in many cases to our children. So it's not just more Black teachers and leaders and counselors. They must be properly trained in our way. Very, very important, because you can go from pre-K to postdoctorate and learn nothing about who we are and what works for us. So that's key. That would be the first thing, appropriations for that training. Secondly, appropriations, again, that means money, for Black people to build and maintain our own independent Black schools. Many are already in existence.
That need to be number one.
Yeah, and there are many more who want to do it, but don't know how. They may have the educational expertise, but they don't have the business training to make it happen. And this is where many Black schools fail, is through lack of funding. So it's very, very important that funding be available for that. And then you need to have annual appropriations for parents who want to homeschool their children or send their child to that African-centered school. Then the per pupil expenditure should follow that child to that school. let me pause right here for just a moment. Please don't mix me up with those who are in favor of only charter schools, okay? I had to make a decision long ago to work with where our children, wherever they are. So I've worked with charter schools, independent schools, public schools, private schools.
Yeah, we have to.
Wherever our children are. But I don't want somebody to put me in that little box and say, oh, he's for, that sort of thing. I just want to be very clear about that. And then for the public schools, we must ensure that the public schools infuse African and African-American cultural content into the curriculum, not just in the social studies class and not just African-American, African and African-American across the curriculum. There is a law that deals with this in Florida. It was actually the subject of my doctoral dissertation. Florida passed this law in 1994. And of all the states that I looked at that had Black history laws in education, Florida's was the most comprehensive. Why? Because it wasn't just dealing with the social studies classroom, it was dealing with every classroom across the curriculum. Not only that, it didn't just talk about teaching about slavery or African-American history. It had the African and African-American contribution must be taught, but teachers can't teach what they don't know. And this is why it's important that if you put a teacher in front of my child, they need to be trained in these different modalities as well, okay? And then lastly, when we look at higher education, college is good, college is okay, but everybody is not going to go to college, and everybody doesn't necessarily need to go to college. Now, this is a college professor speaking, right? Okay, so it's very, very important, and whenever I'm talking to high school students, I share this with them. There need to be appropriations for students to be trained and certified in auto mechanics, HVAC, which is heating and air, electrician, plumbing, and welding, construction, carpentry, barbering, and cosmetology. These are things where young people can make money immediately. So while my 17-year-old son will go to college, the program that he's in right now, where he's learning videography, and Atlanta is what they call the Hollywood of the South. He could literally leave high school and go directly into the industry and make as much and maybe even more than I make as a college professor coming out of high school, okay? So because it's about skills. So I tell young people, it's not just enough to have the paper, you gotta have skills. What are your skills, okay? And that's why I pay my sons to do my videography, right? So, and then students that want to learn business administration or entrepreneurship, we find out that a number of our young people want to start their own businesses, they just don't know how and they haven't been taught. This is something that can be done at the junior college level to provide these different kind of trainings and certification. At the higher education level, next, HBCUs must be properly funded, whereas HBCUs have never been properly funded, okay? And the first thing is to be able to hire the proper faculty and improve their infrastructure. Very, very important that these kinds of annual appropriations be made to HBCUs. Watch this, Sister Zakiya. Absolute dismissal of all student loans. We're talking about reparations in education. No Black person should ever have to pay anything for their education when their education was flat out denied for hundreds of years. And it was against the law for us to be educated. There should be free tuition and room and board for Blacks for whatever college or university that they want to attend. And then you need to have annual appropriations, funding, that's the money, for there to be continuing research about reparations, its implementation to hold the government accountable. Why do I say that? There's something in policy development that's called fidelity of implementation, meaning the law passed, fidelity of implementation says, are you acting in accordance with the law? There needs to be funding so that Black scholars can do the research to make sure that the reparations legislation is being followed to the T. That requires resources. That requires faculty that have been trained to do that kind of research. those are just a few of the
I
recommendations.
would add community organizations as well as organizers to keep the pressure up on elected officials and whoever is in charge of the implementation process. I think that the research marrying the academy with actual community activism and organizers,
Yes.
I think is going to be critical to the implementation stage. This has been great, Dr. Akua. It don't even seem like we've been on here an hour. The comments are through the roof. Sister Angie Barfield commented, she said, I proudly use Dr. Akua's resources with my students. Their development over a 6-month period has been amazing. Their pride and self was truly transformative. She said, all parents and educators need these books that you referenced earlier. She said it leads to some good dialogue. Ashe. So
All right, wonderful.
I already know people want to know how to get in touch with you because these comments have been off the chain. People were very, very engaged. How can people reach you and stay in touch with you, Dr. Akua?
The easiest way to get me is Dr. Akua at drakua.net. That's DRAKUA at drakua.net. Dr. Akua at drakua.net. DRAKUA at drakua.net.
That's wonderful. This has been great. I'm actually going to keep in contact with you in terms of this virtual town hall that you and I have been talking about. I think it would be great to actually have you come on and talk about that education and reparations platform, because that's exactly the kind of direction I think we need to be going into. But thank you so much for coming and sharing. You shared a lot. You dropped a lot. This has probably been one of you and Dr. King and Brother Omawale have probably like been the most engaged, I would say, guest that I've had on, and this has just been amazing. So we'll definitely have to have you back at some point, but we're definitely going to have you on the virtual town hall. So in terms of for our audience, thank you all so much for listening. Next week we will have Brother Arash Danez, who is a college professor out in California, who will talk about his work in youth activism and education activism in the collegiate level. So we'll be having him on next week and looking forward to that. This has been your Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy series this week with your guests, myself, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. We're signing off now. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining.